Good morning and welcome to worship. I'm grateful that you've decided to join us today. We're continuing today in our series on the Sermon on the Mount by looking at another one of Jesus' famous "You have heard it said, but I say to you" statements. Today's sermon is about how we respond when we've been wrong. Have you ever been wrong before? Taken advantage of? Of course you have. I have too. When that happens, what do? Do you fight back, or do you ignore what's been done and hope that it goes away? Are you the kind of person that just runs away from problems and conflict? That's what most people do when they're hurt or humiliated. They fight back or they take off, fight or flight, right? But is that a holy response? Is that what Jesus would have us do when we've been wronged as individuals or even entire communities of people? Well, our passage from the Sermon on the Mount today reminds us of what's been done through most of human history. The most natural reaction to being abused or taken advantage of is to seek revenge and demand justice. So Jesus says, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." That's the oldest recorded law in human history. It's often known or called the lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. It's a law so old that it actually predates Scripture and is found in the Code of Hammurabi. The concept is simple enough to grasp. If someone hurts you, then you can return the equivalent amount of hurt back on them. So what do you think of that law? Does it sound good to you? Do you like it? Or is it a little too violent? Is it fair or too barbaric? In reality, even though this may not sound like it, this law was the beginnings of mercy in human history, because it's the first law we're aware of that puts a limit on revenge. Prior to this, and even afterwards, of course, many societies operated under something known as blood oaths. With a blood oath, if I blinded you in one eye on purpose or even by accident, it was perfectly normal and legal to expect you to gather your family or clan and to come after me in order to kill me and to kill my family and even kill my entire community or clan. I think that's a little extreme, right? So the lex talionis put an end to that. Now, if I hurt you, you could return that hurt on me equally, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus, as he's done before in the Sermon on the Mount, says that life in the kingdom of God is very different than what's normal for the rest of the world. Jesus said, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer." When you're hurt, when you've been wronged, do not resist an evildoer. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds an awful lot like Jesus is saying that when we're hurt or wronged, we aren't supposed to do anything. That maybe we're just supposed to forgive the person who's hurt us or passively accept what's happened. Is that how you understand what Jesus says here? Many Christians look at this way, that Christians are called to be nice and called to forgive and called to love. So if people harm us or wrong us, we really shouldn't fight back. We don't retaliate. We don't seek revenge. Some go so far as to suggest we don't even seek justice. Just forgive people. Don't resist. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Is that what Jesus wants us to do? Does Jesus just want Christians to forgive those who wrong them and not resist? Well, the answer is no. Sure, we need to forgive, but contrary to popular opinion, Jesus doesn't call us to passively sit back and allow people to hurt us or to hurt others. Even though Jesus does say to turn the other cheek and go the extra mile, he meant something completely different than what we understand those things to mean. Just like he meant something completely different than passive nonviolence when he said, "Do not resist an evildoer." And here's why I say that. That word resist in Greek is the word antisteni, and that literally translates to stand, steni, against, anti. The word antisteni in Greek was actually a technical term used to describe ancient warfare. So when you went into battle and met your opponent in the middle of the battlefield, it was there that you stood against your enemy and hacked away at them with your weapons and tried to do as much damage as you possibly could. To stand against an opponent in war was to inflict the maximum amount of damage and violence as possible, whether you win the battle or not. You simply make your stand and hurt your enemy. Now, everyone listening to Jesus originally would have made the association between the word antisteni and the kind of graphic violence you see in war movies like Saving Private Ryan or Hacksaw Ridge. So when Jesus said, "Do not antisteni an evildoer," what he was really saying was, don't inflict violence against an evildoer, which is what we usually want, right? When someone inflicts violence or harm against us, we want them to pay. We want them to suffer. We want them to hurt like we've been hurt, an eye for an eye. But Jesus says, in your personal relationships, individual to individual, family to family, community to community, that's not God's way. Don't inflict violence against an evildoer is what that phrase really means. And what that also means then is that we can resist evil, just in a holy way. You don't sit there and take it passively. You actively resist evil, just without violence. That's why the translation of that word resist is a bad translation, and in just about every new translation of Scripture, that word isn't used anymore. Because we know that Jesus wants us to resist evil always. Jesus always resisted evil. He just did so without violence. And each and every one of us who have been baptized, at least baptized in the United Methodist tradition, we have vowed to do the same. In every one of our baptisms, we vowed to resist evil in whatever form it presents itself. So when something evil is happening, or when we or others are being hurt or harmed in any possible way, yes, we forgive. But we're also obligated, even called by Christ, to resist that evil. The question then becomes how? If we can't fight, we can't run away, what do we do? What does holy resistance look like? Well, Jesus gave a few examples of how he called those in the first century to overcome and resist evil that wasn't picking a fight, wasn't running away. Jesus' way was a third way to resist that evil that didn't mean violence, responding to violence with violence, but instead, Jesus' third way was about being assertive, strong, and creative. Where do you need a third way of responding to conflict and harm in your life that's assertive, strong, and creative? Where has fighting with violent action or even just violent and aggressive words gotten you nowhere? Where has running away and ignoring problems gotten you nowhere? Where are you desperately in need of a response that is strong, assertive, and creative? Don't you think that's what our country needs right now too? Don't you think we desperately need a third way of dealing everything that's wrong in our world? Because certainly fighting isn't working. Trying to ignore our problems isn't working. We need a holy way that is assertive, strong, and creative. So what does that look like? Let's look at 3 illustrations of this holy way that come from New Testament scholar Walter Wink. The first example of holy resistance is that when you are struck on the right cheek, Jesus says, turn your left cheek also. Now, what do you picture when you hear that? I bet you imagine someone punching a person in the face, yes? You hit them on one side, and then rather than fighting back, the person offers their other cheek to be hit next. Most people imagine that, and it seems so stupid, illogical, submissive, certainly the opposite of being strong and assertive and creative. But get rid of that picture in your mind. That's not what people listening to Jesus heard or imagined when they listened to him say that. We have to understand this example from the cultural viewpoint of a first century person in Israel, okay? To punch someone in the right cheek who's looking straight at you, which hand do you have to use? Your left hand, right? You can't punch someone's right cheek with your right hand when they're looking straight at you. It's impossible, okay? Stand in front of a mirror and try to hit your right cheek with your right hand, reaching out to that person in the mirror. You can't do it. So to punch a person in the right cheek, you have to use your left hand. But that creates a problem for how we usually imagine this story, because people living in first century Israel never used their left hands to punch, period. Why not? Well, because the left hand was considered unclean, primarily because it's the left hand that you would use for toilet paper in the ancient world, okay? Lovely picture, but that's the reality. So the only way to hit someone on the right cheek was to use a backhanded slap, not a punch. Slapping people with your backhand was incredibly common in the ancient world. Masters slapped their slaves' right cheeks with their right backhand all the time, as did husbands to their wives and children, as did Romans to Jews. None of those are good things, but it was a commonly accepted practice in those days. Everybody who was originally listening to Jesus, unlike us, knew that to strike someone on the right cheek wasn't meant to hurt them. It was meant to humiliate them, to insult them, to show power and dominance over someone, to put that person in the place. Don't tell me what to do. You're not in charge. That was a common act of humiliation and insult, to strike someone on the right cheek with the right hand. But Jesus said, if that happens to you because someone wants to humiliate you or belittle you or embarrass you, turn and offer your left cheek as well. Why? To be humiliated again? No. The exact opposite. Offering your left cheek was a form of protest, a way of putting the person who hit you in an impossible situation. In turning your left cheek, it was like saying, I refuse to accept this kind of treatment anymore. Turning the left cheek was saying, I'm not less than you. I'm a human being just like you. And I refuse to be humiliated any longer because I am an equal. I am a child of God. I'm not going to take it anymore. When Jesus said, turn the left cheek, that's what his original listeners heard loud and clear. And here's why. If you offered your left cheek, the person trying to put you in your place couldn't slap you anymore. Sure, they could slap you if they used their left hand, but they'd be breaking the law by making you unclean, and they would then be embarrassed and publicly shamed. Which means as you sat there with your left cheek waiting to be hit, the only option for them is to punch you with their right hand, which wasn't an insult. Punching a person was an act of violence, an inappropriate use of force, and anyone who saw it happen would have come running to your aid. Just like if you saw me walk up to someone at church and punch them in the face, every single one of you would come running to say, what, and pull me away and say, what is wrong with you, Pastor Eric? But for the aggressor to do nothing in that situation, as the person sat there with their left cheek presented, to do nothing meant acknowledging that person as an equal. So if a Jew turned their left cheek to a Roman and the Roman did not hit them, then the Roman who considered themselves superior would be admitting that they weren't. When Jesus said, turn your cheek, it was an act of holy resistance. It was an invitation to stand up for oneself, not by answering violence with violence, but in a holy way that is neither cowardly submission nor violent revenge. It was strong, assertive, and creative. Stand with integrity and invite the evildoer to cross the line so that others will see their evil and say, enough is enough. This kind of holy resistance works, folks. Scientific data and studies have been done that have looked at all the different major social changes that have happened in our country and around the world in the last 100 years. And in these studies that have been done, nonviolent resistance and protests like this has resulted in either partial or complete success 73% of the time, versus protests and resistance that became violent, which only partially or completely had success 33% of the time. Nonviolently declaring your equal humanity, inviting those doing evil to cross the line through holy resistance works. Best example of this comes, of course, from Martin Luther King Jr., who, inspired by Jesus' words, taught others in the civil rights movement to do exactly this thing. King invited people to stand against those with guns and hoses and sticks by walking tall and chanting or holding signs that said, I am a man. I'm a human being. I'm equal to you. You don't intimidate me. You won't put me in my place. To shut me up, you'll have to cross the line, which means winning the battle against me, but losing the war. That, of course, happened to King. People crossed the line and killed him. But rather than end the civil rights movement, it only created more support for it. Those who killed him won the battle against King, but lost the war. When Jesus said to turn the other cheek, he wasn't suggesting to become a doormat or a wallflower. He said, declare your equality, because your oppressor will be forced to either accept it, or when they do something terrible in response, you will have gained power to change the system and situation. That's example number one of holy resistance. Nonviolent, assertive, strong, creative. In example number two, Jesus said, if someone takes your coat, give them your cloak as well. This is actually a courtroom example. a financial example. You see, in the first century, Roman political policy caused countless people in Israel to fall into major debt for the first time in their lives. This is probably why many of Jesus' stories talk about people facing impossible debts that they can't seem to overcome. It was common. People got it. So to pay off debt in those days, usually you'd sell an animal or a portion of your land. But if you didn't have animals or if you didn't have land, which less and less people in Israel began to have as Romans took that land and gave it to absentee landlords to rule over, all you had for most people was the shirt off your back, literally. People wore two basic garments in those days. You had an undergarment that was very light, like an undershirt, but was robe length and essentially your form of underwear. And then you had a coat that was thicker that would protect you from the weather and wind during the day, and that you would lay over yourself as a blanket at night. When you literally had nothing else and were in debt and got sued, it was that heavier coat that people would take from you. The strange thing, of course, was that they couldn't keep it, and they knew it. Because in Deuteronomy 24:13, there's a provision that was laid out that you could only take someone's coat from them during the daytime. Legally, you had to give it back every night so that they wouldn't get cold and die. So when these rich people began suing poor people for their coats, they knew they couldn't keep them. So the question was, why were they doing it? Well, all they really wanted to do was shame and embarrass the poor by making them parade around all day in their underwear. It was really just an attempt to strip people of their dignity, which of course is evil. So when Jesus said, if someone demands and takes your coat or outer garment, give them your undergarment also, what he was really saying was to expose the evil of this by exposing yourself. Giving your undergarment literally meant stripping naked in the courtroom to kind of make it clear what was really going on here. These people didn't really want those coats. They were trying to strip them of their dignity. And so let's reveal that by stripping, right? Ironically, doing that would have made that naked debtor and the person suing them equals again in the law. It probably confuses you. How is that possible? Well, nakedness, of course, was extremely taboo in Judaism, but it was far less shameful to be naked than to see someone else who was naked. So in a darkly humorous sort of way, if you were to strip in the courtroom when someone demanded your coat, the debtor would be stripping the person suing them of their dignity by pointing out the injustice of the system that allowed the rich to profit from the poorest of the poor through embarrassment. Them stripping would make the rich more shameful than the person in debt. And doing that would actually lead to the end of these frivolous lawsuits because the rich people didn't want to be exposed like that. Pretty brilliant, right? So Jesus, when he says this, wasn't saying, give those who are taking advantage of you everything you have. Instead, Jesus was saying, through humor and embarrassment, unmask the injustice, restore the equality, stand up for yourself non-violently, and in so doing, you'll create a more just system. That's example number 2 of holy resistance. Example number 3. If anyone compels you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. What's this one about? Roman soldiers in those days were allowed to force anyone they wanted to into a variety of forced labor situations. An example of this takes place in the crucifixion story, when Simon of Cyrene was picked out of the crowd and forced by Roman soldiers to carry Jesus' cross on the way to the crucifixion. Jesus literally couldn't carry his cross anymore since he was half dead, and the soldiers, of course, didn't want to do it, and so they forced Simon into service. If Simon had tried to resist that order, it would have meant that he was either imprisoned or severely beaten, and so Simon did it, probably very unhappily, given the circumstances, because I imagine that meant as Simon carried Jesus' cross under compulsion of the soldiers, that some of the spit and other things being thrown at Jesus landed on him instead. Roman soldiers did this to Jewish peasants all the time. But the law was very clear that you could not make anyone carry anything for more than a mile. If that happened, if the soldier made someone carry something more than a mile, they would be strictly punished for an abuse of power by being lashed or having their food rations withheld, or having to pay a fine. So imagine for a second how shocked or even scared a soldier would be when a person refused to stop after a mile. Just picture this soldier and peasant getting to the end of the 1 mile when the peasant says, "No, no, don't stop. We can keep going. I'm good. I'd like to carry it a little farther for you." To which, of course, the soldier would respond, "What are you talking about? What's going on here? Why are you offering to carry this further? Are you trying to get me in trouble?" "No, no, no," the peasant would say. "I'm just choosing to be kind. I'm choosing to go farther. I won't tell anybody about what's happened. You won't get in trouble." "Well, why would you do that?" "Nobody does that. This has got to be a trick." "No, no trick. I'm just going to take it another mile. This can't be right. You must think that I'm weak. Is that it? Give me back my pack or I'll show you just how strong I am." "No, no, I don't think you're weak. I'm not giving you your pack back. It's fine. Let's just keep going." If people did what Jesus said to do in that situation, do you know what that was doing? The peasant would once again be claiming power in a situation meant to make them feel powerless. They would be taking away that feeling of superiority that the soldier would feel towards them and flip the script by causing the soldier, who normally inflicted fear of violence into the peasant, to experience fear themselves, not because of the peasant's violence, but because of the peasant's kindness. It may also have forced the soldier to have empathy with those they were abusing by fearing the same things happening to them that they so enjoyed making those peasants feel. Jesus in none of these examples told people to be doormats. None of these examples called for them to be weak or pushovers or simply just to let whatever happens, happens. He was really telling them to be strong. It takes great strength to resist evil nonviolently. It takes even greater strength to resist evil nonviolently and non-vindictively. That's probably right after giving these examples of nonviolent resistance, that Jesus says to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You see, the goal isn't for the oppressed to become the oppressor. It's simply to reclaim dignity denied. It's to create a recognition of common humanity as people who are all created in the image of God, to restore equality, to point out evil and abuse of power in a nonviolent way that results in change to unjust systems and abuses of power. What Jesus says in this part of the Sermon on the Mount is really summed up perfectly by Francis Bacon, who said, "When we meet evil with evil, at the very best, we become the same as our oppressor. But if we don't meet evil with evil, we've overcome the oppression." Holy resistance is something Jesus calls us to do for ourselves and for others. It's not a guarantee that everything will fix itself just because we do it. We live in an imperfect world. Nonviolence doesn't change everything completely, and it's often responded to with violence by people in positions of authority and power. We already talked about how that happened to Martin Luther King Jr. Jesus, of course, also met the same fate. He resisted evil with strength and creativity without violence, but he was still crucified, which means it's dangerous to be holy resistors of evil. But it's also who we're called to be. It's the path we've been invited by Jesus to take that Jesus promises will lead to life. If we do it, it can change the world. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't fix everything broken in the United States when it comes to racism, but he changed the world. Certainly Jesus changed and still changes the world today, but only because when he was punched in one cheek, he offered his others to the soldiers who beat him and mocked him before the crucifixion. When he was stripped of his coat, he offered his cloak to hang naked on the cross, pointing out the shame of what was being done to him. When he was asked to go 1 mile, he didn't ask for the cup to pass from him, but went all the way to Golgotha. He did that not because he was weak. He did it because he was strong. He forced others to cross a line. And when they did, they won their battle against him. But Jesus won the war against sin and death for us all. So we worship him and we follow him. And today I invite you to seek to live as he lived, by resisting evil in whatever forms it presents itself, with strength, creativity, and holiness every day. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.